You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to the CraftsmenOnLine podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmenOnline.com. I always feel every time I talk with you, Brother Nagy, and I read the disclaimer that we do that it could apply, it definitely should apply, and it does apply to this particular episode, as we're about to boldly go where few Freemasons venture, and that's into talking about politics and religion in Lodge. But before we get there, welcome back to the show.
Once again, Brother Michael, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege.
Well, I always like when I have you on because I have to step up my research game about this much. Your viewers will see what I'm doing, but for those listeners, it's a lot. And for this one, I had to go back to the Anderson Constitution of 1721, where the exact words, and I'm paraphrasing this just for us with modern English, is basically don't eat, don't drink too much, don't engage in personal conversations in or after Lodge that touch on politics and religion. In a nutshell, that's kind of what Anderson was pulling together, but yet he used Old English. So if Freemasonry welcomes free thinking and like-minded men, why would this charge need to be included in the constitutions?
Oh, so much that you have touched upon, Michael. It's like, where do I begin? First of all, let's rewind to what it is that you quoted from the Constitution. It really doesn't say what you just quoted. It basically says that we're to engage in easy and free conversation and make sure that nothing that you put out there is offensive and will blast the harmony of the lodge. And therefore, and I'm going to quote it, no private piques or quarrels must be brought within the door of the lodge. More or less, any quarrels about religion or nations or state policy, we being only as Masons of the Catholic religion above mentioned. And that is a reference to what was regarding religion earlier on. But notice that it says, therefore, no private piques or quarrels must be brought within the doors of the lodge. And it's interesting how that has been translated to the proscription of politics and religion from the lodge, because it doesn't say there's a prescription. There's no prohibition other than no piques or quarrels to be brought within the lodge, meaning that you are bringing them from the outside to the inside. And with that being said, the conditions are pretty straightforward. You can talk anything that you want to talk as long as it promotes the harmony of the lodge, which means that if you are bringing up political and or religious themes in any way, shape, or form, you've got to do it within the harmony of what is expected and make sure that it's easy and comfortable to your brothers. And that's a whole lot different than prescribing both topics from the lodge. And, you know, it reminds me of Eve in the Garden of Eden, where the serpent says, hey, you know, chick, did God say you can't eat of the fruit? And Eve turns around and says, oh, we can't even touch it, at least we die. And I'm saying to myself, well, God didn't say that. But what's happened is, and the same thing would happen with Eve and the serpent, the proscription was there to kind of go overboard, saying, well, you know, Anderson's Constitution says we shouldn't bring in this, that, and the other, and why don't we just prescribe the entire thing out of existence? Therefore, we don't have to deal with anything. And the fact of the matter is, we'll go back a little bit further to where Anderson was talking about regarding religion. And if you rightly understand the art, you will not be an irreligious freethinker, meaning that you will be very, very respectful of your use of free thought.
Mm.
I hope that answers your question.
Well, I have my viewpoints on this as well, because I think that this is, and this seems to be our trend for 2020 this season. The third season of the Craftsman Online podcast between you and I is going through and finding some of these myths or mythos in our ritual or work, and hey, we're gonna expose these and let's have a discussion about it.
Oh my God, we're talking about a Masonic unicorn again.
Yes, we've stumbled onto another one. So I'm with you. I think that not being able to discuss politics or religion in lodge is not exactly what word for word the intent of the Anderson's Constitution is, and obviously we kind of break those, because if we're not supposed to be talking about them at all, well, then you could go easily to the first degree in the charge, where we're told to be good citizens, and any talking about government or leaders or the president or whatever, well, that's talking about politics. That is going to be divisive. Secondly, religion, I mean, that's the much bigger moving target in Freemasonry, is that if you are offended about the idea of being in a religious setting, so to speak, well, you probably wouldn't feel comfortable stepping foot into a temple. That might be the first place where you turn and walk out. You also, upon entering a Masonic lodge room, would see an altar at the center with what we call the volume of sacred law, the Holy Bible. It's got plenty of terms, but you'll see many religious, in some jurisdictions, many religious works on the altar. In some jurisdictions, we can actually open all of them, but in like New York State, you can only open up the volume of sacred law from that lodge. So if you have a problem with religion and it's divisive, I think that is going to be a cutoff point. Not to mention that we pray in lodge meetings, that there's several religious and biblical historical facts or connections that are linked in throughout our rituals. So yeah, I'm with you. Like literally, I don't know where it came from, but I can see where it's going. And I'll just kind of pivot to this one, is that I remember sitting in lodge one time, listening to a lecture and thinking back as a story was told. And I'm sure we've heard these before, where, brothers during the Civil War, they were on different sides of the belief system for this at the Civil War time. And yet these miraculous stories of rescuing each other or not shooting upon the other brother Mason. And I sat there and thought, like, well, that kind of is the two together, right? That's politics and religion. That's a private pique and quarrel that they were not allowing outside of lodge, not just necessarily in it. Like, could you imagine what those conversations would have been like?
Well, we're going to rewind once again. You referred to a lot of religious themes and symbolisms and religious behaviors, but none of them were religion. They were all religious. And
True.
We talked, I think we touched upon this one or two episodes before. There is a major difference between religious and religion. One's an adjective and one's a noun. And it's the noun that supposedly is prescribed. And kind of rewinding a little bit more, when you're talking about the charge, I've gone through a lot of charges from a lot of different jurisdictions, and some of them haven't literally written in there a sentence prescribing religion and politics in the EA charge. And yet there are other charges where it's not even touched upon.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking about, well, once again, is this an innovation, or is it something that was written out or written in?
Right. Well, and it seems to me like if we were to examine the intent of what Anderson's Constitution was, and it is to kind of set up this framework of really what they're trying to avoid, or what I think the goal was, is that if you came into a lodge room, you subscribe to the idea of harmony, that you would be able to listen, respect, allow the discourse to be civil with brothers. And if we go back and like, wow, that was like almost 200 plus years ago that this was written, how would you rate it? How would you score that? Did the attempt accomplish the mission? Did we reach the goal?
Yes and no. And I'm going to give you an example. I have some dear, dear brothers who have actually recently approached me saying, John, you're not going to believe this, but we have brothers who on their bumpers have political slogans. And
Mm,
I'm not even going to go into them, but they're political slogans and religious references. And he said, it's clearly evident that they pull up in their 4x4s and what have you, and they've got these bumper stickers in their windows and on their bumpers, and they come into lodge and they carry it into lodge with them. And he said, I don't know the impact that's going to have on candidates coming through who haven't even petitioned yet and pull up to the lodge and see all these bumper stickers and say, that's not the political philosophy that I lean toward. And if that's what's on the outside of the building, I can only imagine what's going on inside the building. And
mm,
of course, he says, John, their worst imaginings are real because what's going on inside the building is more of the same. And so I understand the prescription and I understand why some jurisdictions literally have it written in the entered apprentice charge because there's validity to it. There's brothers who dogmatically stick to verbatim, the literal verbatim script that we call ritual. And so, therefore, if the jurisdiction has that as a prescription, they're going to adhere to it. And so, what I just described outside the lodge on bumper stickers and windows, these same individuals would not have that on their vehicles because the charge basically prohibits it.
right.
And yet I know their jurisdictions, and the one jurisdiction that I'm referring to does not have that in their charge. And therefore, you're seeing it on their bumpers, and you're seeing it in their windows, and you're hearing it in the lodge.
Mm.
So
Well,
when you ask about how good has it been, well, it's been good in some areas.
right. Well, I think the intent of it was, and you hit it up when you were quoting Anderson's Constitution, is that it was really kind of meant as a tool to, I don't want to say protect, but that might be the better term to use, brothers of the Catholic faith, because during that time in the 17th, 18th century, you had the massive change with the Church of England and opening the doors and all of these different viewpoints that were beginning to have. And that was like radical. I mean, it's interesting to think about it now in modern times, but back then, religion was so much more a part of people's lives that you would literally get burned at the stake if you practiced a different theology than perhaps your neighbor or what was going on in town. To where if you go up to today, I think that the intent, if it was still great, I would be personally offended if, sticking on the religious topic, and I've never seen this, and I hope I never ever see it in the craft, but if a brother just got up and started spouting off why one religion was better than another, that's having a conversation and putting it in a divisive way. But standing up to give historical resource or pointing out things using biblical text that everybody, as our work says, that we agree that that's the foundation of all goodness, and that all works, then sure, that's fine. I've sat in many of those, and actually conversations I've had with you, or I have my little notepad here. I'm like, well, I got to jot this one down to do some Bible study on this so I can see where John's connecting these points from.
Michael, I'm going to say this. Constitutions use the word Catholic not to denote a religion, but to denote the universal religion. And that is the one to which all agree. And if you read regarding religion in the Constitution that Anderson put forth, he describes religion, that universal religion, being one where we all get along and we're good men and we honor our words. And that's what he meant when he wrote Catholicism. He wasn't talking about the Catholic faith. He was talking about the universal religion that is recognized by all Masons to be divorced from any kind of established religion and connected to the fact that we all agree that we're going to be our word and be good men, upstanding. And again, if you read the Constitution and get all the if, then, therefores out, it's pretty straightforward that he was actually describing what that universal religion was to which all men agree. And it's like so many things are written down in the context of the times. And here we are 300 years later, and we can't assume that the words that were written down 300 years ago mean what we take them to mean today. We have to become a student and understand the context to which the word was being used.
It's so great. I just did a whole conversation with a brother as we were putting a presentation on biblical terms and the difference then thousands of years ago to where we are now. And it's just, to my mind, I'm like, I didn't even think about, how a word 300 years ago would definitely have a different meaning than where we are today, especially with how we're using English in the modern world.
Precisely. And I'm trying to look it up right now. Maybe I shouldn't be focusing on that, but it's such a strong point. I encourage the listener to look at the Anderson Constitution aspect where he talks about that universal religion to which all men agree. And it's beautiful. It really is poetic. The man captured the essence of what universal religion is. And it's not our religion. It's just the religion that where he's describing where all men agree. And
right.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that could also be, as some would say, perhaps the glory and beauty of the day. If harmony really did exist between all tribes of men, that would be fantastic. And that would be obviously something we would want to use as a foundation for Freemasonry.
Amen. So where are we in the interview?
Well, I think we've pretty much concluded the conversation on religion. That really, personally, I feel, and I'm sure you would be on board with it as well, is that if one brother was to stand up and start spouting off to another brother or group of brothers or just people that weren't represented in the room, that one faith was better than the other faith because of their bias or beliefs in it, that we would probably sit there and go, we're not supposed to naturally prescribe to that. As you've said, we're supposed to have a more harmonious look and look for the holistic approach to it. So that leaves us with the other swinging door, which that one just goes around and around, and that's politics.
Oh,
now you had talked about the bumper stickers on the car. I think that we do see that a lot in modern times. It didn't even, I was sitting here going, well, let's go back to the beginning of the country and how America was basically formed by revolutionists who just happened, a handful of them, be what are now today's famous Freemasons, and all of these moments throughout the history of our country, which is short when you compare it to the rest of the world, in the differences and the divisiveness that has happened. I'm like, you don't have to go very far back. You can just go back to the last presidential election or the one that's coming up in about a year, and it still exists today. It's still happening. So I guess that's the big issue is that for a fraternity that has that history of brothers that are tied to liberty, democracy, free thinking, how possible is it for us to stay away from conversations that would be in the social discourse around politics?
When I look back at what ritual is actually espousing that we focus on, we have so much to work on based on what ritual points us toward, that to get distracted by superfluities and vices is really, it's just not in the program. And so therefore, how easy it is for us to avoid these topics? Well, honestly, if you're focusing on what ritual tells us we need to be focusing on, it's real easy. You're too busy to be distracted by something that is, again, superfluous or even a vice. It's stuff that is not in the program of Freemasonry. And therefore, it shouldn't even be talked about in Lodge because we have so much more to be focusing on that's more important. Our mission's pretty clear. And if we're not adhering to the mission of Freemasonry, then why are we actually coming to lodge?
I'm just jotting down a homework assignment for brothers that may be listening.
I did find that thing concerning God and religion.
Mm,
And a Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law. All right, straightforward. And I love this. If he rightly understands the art, he will never be stupid or irreligious. I don't care what you put after those two. The fact of the matter is, if you understand the art, you're not going to be stupid or irreligious. And therefore, what happens is we go for that we should oblige ourselves to that religion in which all men agree, to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty. Now, I took an entire paragraph and I took the if, for, thens, and all that other stuff. I basically, that's the religion in which all men agree. Be good men and true, and honor and honesty. And so if we adhere to what Anderson had put forth, it doesn't matter what your faith might be. The religion that we all agree has those elements. And that's what we ought to stick with. So back to your homework assignment. Sorry.
Well, no, I'm going to say agreed to that point because yeah, that's the period at the end of the sentence of the statement that I'd made. And, on the religion or on the politics front, because it is and always will be and continues to be divisive, a homework assignment I would give to a brother listener is we have had a ton of famous free American Masons that have been in politics. And instead of listening to their words, I would challenge you to go read some of their written words and see if you can find possible Masonic influence that has been used in those words. And if you can identify those Masonic principles, then that should tell you that even somebody that you may have moral or social differences on for whatever the issue is, at least there is that bond that still connects us, that line that keeps that harmony going.
I'm going to rewind. You used the word divisive. I love the
Yes.
homework assignment, by the way. Politics and religion are not divisive. It is the individuals who start to discuss them in their immature, unsubscribed state. They use it to divide.
Correct.
The topics themselves are not divisive. In fact, the topics are of utmost importance in every man's life. But if you use them to divide the lodge and create divisiveness and peaks and quarrels, the very thing that is asked to be kept outside the lodge, then what you're doing is you're not practicing temperance. You are not subscribing and subduing your passions and desires. And if you have not done the work of the entered apprentice degree, the work that is pointed out by the degree, not doing the actual degree itself, but the work that the degree points us toward, what happens is it'll be very clear in your conversation, because what will happen is your passion will overflow and spill all over the place and get everybody bloody. And that's exactly what happens. You will create divisiveness because you are expressing your immaturity in the craft directly to your brothers.
Right.
No,
I totally agree. The whole time you're describing this, I'm thinking, of my situation personally. I live in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital.
my
and
commiserations.
Where politics is something that people regularly talk about here and freely get into conversations about. And I work supporting people in the healthcare industry, especially their initiatives and missions that they want to do with Congress or the administration or whatnot. And without giving away too much about my personal beliefs or value system, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about a solution to the healthcare problem, or one of the issues with equity or access, whatever you like. And he put out his ideas. And I was like, well, that's really interesting that that's something that you want to do. And he's like, well, yeah, that's, something that the Republican Party has suggested. And I looked at him and I was like, Republicans are concerned. And I was like, I'm not used to hearing about that. And so then we had a side conversation, and I realized that it's something that even today, as a Freemason and as a grown man, that I prefer to not know what your personal beliefs or viewpoints are on things, because I want to hear your ideas and judge them on the merit of what you're presenting, versus as soon as you say, oh, well, I voted this way the last 4 elections, and I would be almost prompted to say, oh, well, what are you going to have to say that contributes to this conversation? Probably a lot, and I should listen to it. I think that that's the big issue, is that I think if you're driving around with, license plates, other paraphernalia that identifies your strong stance on an issue that could be divisive, that's exactly what Anderson is saying in the Constitutions. Hey, leave that stuff outside the lodge room. Certainly it wouldn't be appropriate to walk in with a tie or a pin or something that would identify you in that direction. But is it fair to say you have to leave your thoughts on those things outside? Not necessarily. Just before you open your mouth, understand that there are other people in the room who could be offended, and you have a better choice of words you're going to use.
And in that respect, I truly do love to hear what I call my brother's best thoughts on things. I could always tell when a brother is sharing their best thoughts, because in their sharing, I get a great opportunity to understand how they came about their conclusions. And there's a whole subsection of my brothers that I just absolutely love talking politics and religion with, because they are the epitome, they are the example of respectful discourse entrepreneurs. They just bring a conversation to the table and everybody buys into it. And then there are the brothers who have never studied the 7 liberal arts and sciences, specifically the trivium. And what happens is they throw something on the table insistently, shoving all sorts of ideas and concepts and ideology and dogma. And the moment that you open your mouth, they start with the ad hominem attacks, and their conversations are filled with logical fallacies. And if they're not filled with logical fallacies, they are filled with unsubscribed passions and unsubdued desires. And they make discourse next to impossible. And they step up to the plate and they volunteer their status as to where they are in their Masonic development by the way they treat other people in the conversation. And this is where Freemasonry prepares members to discuss those particular moments that arise in lodge and outside the lodge. The entirety of the first degree is to get your heart in the right place and bring order to it, so that you're not spilling and bleeding all over people. And, that brings order to the chaos of the heart. And of course, the fellowcraft work is the next step in bringing order to the chaos of the head. And just the trivium alone, understanding logical fallacies, and it allows you to engage in discourse where, if there is a logical fallacy presented and the brother is aware of the training and has gone through it, you point it out, the brother's not going to attack you. They're going to thank you and say, I got to look at that. They'll thank you. I mean, steel sharpening steel here. You got the brothers basically using the political and religious discourse to examine their own faith, and they become stronger as a result of it, not weaker. But that strength can only occur if the brothers first engage in working on themselves, both emotionally and intellectually. And that's where Freemasonry prepares brothers to actually engage in the arena of religion and politics. It's not for inside the lodge. It's the preparatory school. That's where people learn, here's the plan. Here's how I go about perfecting and bringing myself to maturity so that I can discuss these things. And so therefore, I love Freemasonry's plan, because I've become much richer in my faith as a consequence of following the direction, the good orderly direction. There's a beautiful acronym right there that is presented by the rituals that we engage in on a monthly basis. Michael, let me ask you, you had some points that you wanted to make. I recognize we're getting to the end of the recording. You had 2 points that you wanted to run past me. What were they?
Yeah, I don't want to mislead our listener into believing that, hey, if I go to a Masonic hall or a temple, or even hang outside in the parking lot, one of those famed parking lot conversations between brothers, that they're not going to talk about religion or politics. We basically have shared, tonight in our conversation, that those discussions, yes, they do happen. But what I think is unique about Freemasonry is it does help prepare members to discuss or even be actively engaged in these in a respectful way. And you had kind of touched on it with the trivium. The two things that tend to work for me is I always think of the name or word that we hear during the first degree. And it gave me an idea. I want to produce those little, wristbands for them, which is caution. And I always think of that, like, be very careful of your words and actions. It's easy for me to remember caution because I just close my eyes and imagine the big caution, blam, right there. It's like, hey, mouth shut, brain, start thinking about the words we're using here. Let's choose some better words to use than what could potentially upset somebody. The second one is also going back to our ritual and the kind of charge that's given to us as a master mason, and that really the only disagreement, and I'm paraphrasing here, the only disagreement that should exist between masons is who can best work and who can best agree. And that's really where we should leave things at, is that the things that are going to divide us, that's how the bad wins. Let's not allow that to happen. Let's keep moving forward together as kind of this force of goodness.
The lodge is a sanctuary from the world. And when we bring in ideology that is divisive in the way that we present it, that's not what we're there for. We're there to experience the joy of brotherhood, working together to help our fellow brothers improve their heads, improve their hearts, and improve their spirits. When you bring superfluities, excess baggage from the outside world into the lodge and start trying to direct lodge conversations away from the very purpose that we are there for. Let me spell out that purpose. You've heard me say it before. We are ultimately to build a spiritual building. And that spiritual building, in order for that spiritual building to be erected, it has to be in harmony with God's rules and designs. If what comes out of a brother's mouth is affecting that harmony, it has to be reconsidered. And as a master mason, I don't hold back when I see what is being shared is in disharmony with God's rules and designs, when we are attempting to collectively build that spiritual building. I've been charged to do that. And therefore, when a brother does really great, in my view, with bringing harmony into the lodge to the point where everybody's uplifted by their contribution, I'm going to pull them aside and I'm going to say kudos, or sometimes I might even say in lodge kudos in my own special way. But if what they're doing is disrupting that harmony and not uplifting the brothers toward that spiritual building effort, I'm also going to pull them aside and say, hey, let me share with you what I'm seeing going on. Let me show you what is the impact on your brothers. Look at the brothers that are leaving. Are they shaking hands, patting each other on the back and smiling, or are they exiting very, very quietly with their heads kind of held down? There's a huge difference between the contribution that has people sad to leave rather than glad to leave. And I love what Anderson said in his constitutions. Conversation ought to be easy and in harmony. And if it's not, does it really belong? And if there is political problems outside the lodge, They need to remain outside the lodge. The lodge is not there to focus on any political or religious agenda. The only agenda that is there for is how can I help strengthen my brother? And how can they help strengthen me? That's it in a nutshell.
Very well said. Very well said. This has been the Craftsman Online podcast. Big thanks. I love when he comes back. He makes me smarter and he whispers that wise counsel in my ear. Brother John Nagy. Thanks for coming back, Brother John.
Thanks once again for having me, Michael. That's an honor and a privilege, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
Me too. If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We are available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Ta-da!
Ba-dum-bum.
Beep beep.